Impacts of unreliable safety data. My name is Cassie Bolter and I'm the Events and Partnerships Manager at Centus. Today's presenters are CEO from Centus, Anthony Gibbs. Anthony has worked with thousands of people across hundreds of organisations globally and to develop safety culture solutions that support strategy and enable the person component to reach its full potential. He is committed to the application of psychology to enhance human performance for over 19 years, and his background as a psychologist has informed his cognitive behavioural insight. And joining him is Centus GM Strategic Growth, Alex Fernando, who brings with him several years of serious injury and fatality prevention expertise in the high-risk sector. Alex has been working to enhance Centus's portfolio of services in the operating context and has included the development of critical risk cultural diagnostics, incident analytics, and critical control assurance. Thanks for joining us. I'll now pass over to Anthony and Alex.
Thanks, Cassie, and welcome, Alex, to your maiden webinar. We'll all be watching and marking closely, so no pressure.
Thanks, Ant. Really pleased to be here.
So really, I guess, timely topic for Alex and I to be talking to everyone about this idea of the impacts of unreliable safety data, because it's a conversation that we're seeing come up at the executive level frequently. And particularly at the board level, when executives are trying to influence boards to think differently about what they measure and track with safety, because so many boards are so reliant and dependent on the traditional safety metrics. And as we're going to unpack and explore, that might not necessarily be telling all of the story. So we'll dive a little bit more into that detail in just a moment. For those of you who have dialed in who are not familiar with Centus, and I can see lots of familiar names on the call as well, a very quick summary of who we are. Our mission at Centus is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. We do that through the application of psychology and neuroscience to help organisations create stronger safety cultures, better safety outcomes, and manage their risk profiles. We've been doing that for about 20 years, and between Alex and I, we've got a fair bit of experience in supporting organisations on that journey. So I'm going to kick off this webinar with a quick question to you, Alex. A bit of context setting, I guess, is why is safety data critical to business decision making?
Oh, look, it's a really good question, Ant, and very central to the context of the conversation today. So look, there's no doubt that data plays a very central role in business decision making more broadly than just safety. There's one of those sayings you probably heard of, what gets measured gets managed. And the issue with this is that the wrong metrics can lead to unintended consequences, especially when it becomes a target. It ceases to become a good measure, right? So I think it's clearly very important to have reliable, insightful, and accessible data where the data can actually enable decision making. From a safety perspective, and as we're talking, actually, Ant, it might be useful for the listeners to provide their comments and reflections in the Q&A chat function. If I'd encourage that, because that way we can kind of add a bit of value to the conversation.
Good call, Alex. We've got a number of questions that have come through that we'll endeavour to address. But if you do have questions that pop out throughout, I'll be managing the question section. Type it in the questions, not the chat. If you do have something you wanted to note, please feel free to drop that comment into the question section, and I'll draw Alex's attention to it. So good prompt, cool. Alex.
And look, to your point around safety data, safety data clearly plays a very important role for organisations, especially where the data is attempting to inform our decisions on around how we keep people safe, right? And the issues that we're noticing with the data we get from the work that we do at Centus is there's probably two primary issues around this. It's not getting enough data, and it's also not getting good quality data. And so no doubt this conversation, Ant, as we progress, we'll unpack some of these drivers. On the underreporting side of things, in terms of getting enough data, there's probably 2 or 3 areas that I feel we need to kind of better understand, and they probably revolve around 3 areas in particular. Not knowing how to categorize the data and understand the data and extract value of the data often leads to underreporting. It amplifies the lack of reporting. The second area is there's a challenge to get the data to tell a meaningful story. How do you get the right story, and enable more proactive decision making? And the third area really revolves around the impact data has on the culture of an organisation. And what I mean by that is that it does send a message about what's most important to us. Do we focus on the absence of harm or the presence of safety? What are the implications of choosing one suite of metrics versus another? And then also, what's the message that we're sending to people in that, no matter what you do, you can't get hurt, or do you kind of refocus the attention on, what are the things that you can do to keep people safe? So it's a big conversation to kind of unfold, but they're probably the things that are in front of my mind.
Yep, and you're right, Alex, it is a big conversation to unfold. So the way we're going to tackle that conversation is in chunks. And of course, we're always open to catching up with people afterwards if they want to explore any of these concepts in more detail. So the way we're going to, I guess, eat this elephant, for lack of a better term today, is in the following 4 steps. So first, we're going to look at the underreporting and drivers of it. Now, those of you who are regular listeners or dial in regularly to send us, that is a topic that we have covered in some detail before. So we will be going through that fairly rapidly today, but we will be sending a link to a more detailed resource for those of you who want to explore that further to look at. We're going to look at how we can focus on the right data for maximum impact, and how we can use data to reduce risk and serious injury exposure. Now, that number 2 and 3 is, I guess, coming from a realization with a lot of organizations is they spend a lot of time and a lot of energy collecting a lot of safety data, but not necessarily leveraging it to its full extent to get the best outcomes for the organization. So we're going to give you some examples and some thoughts and prompts to consider around leveraging that data to reduce that risk profile. And then finally, we're going to wrap it all up by looking at the role of safety culture in gathering data and implementing change around safety culture. So to kick off this process very quickly, we're going to talk about now why underreporting is an important topic to talk about. So we want to make sure we're addressing underreporting within organizations, because without getting the data that we need from an organization, it impacts on our ability to see trends and themes and address issues proactively. It impacts on our ability to learn and improve from feedback. It impacts on our ability to share lessons learned more widely, fix errors when they occur, and also impacts on our ability to have a safer and more reliable business. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to be getting good quality and quantity data out of the business. But there's the reality is we're not necessarily always getting that data from the organization. There's a few key reasons why that is the case. To kick off, I guess, this conversation around underreporting super quickly, I wanted to get people to sort of, based on their gut feel or their experience or what they know about their organizations, to give us a little bit of a vote here about what percentage of safety incident data they believe goes underreported within their organization. So is it A, 0 to 10, B, 10 to 20, C, 20 to 40, and D, 40 plus? So what level of underreporting do you believe is likely happening within your organization? Give that a minute to play out. All right, we're getting close there by the looks of it.
Feels like the Melbourne Cup sweepstakes, and
it does, watching the numbers go up and down. So Cassie, we might close that one out. And as we can see from the poll there, a bit of a spread across the board, but the majority, 46%, sitting at 20 to 40%, 0 to 10, about 11%, so very low levels of underreporting indicated there, 25%, 10 to 20, 46%, 20 to 40, and 18%, 40 plus. So a real spread across the groups. And that is fairly indicative of the data that we see from organizations, in that we will get a spread of underreporting levels, but the majority will sit within that 40%, 46% range. So the data that we're sharing here, really briefly, is from about 12,500 participants across 9 industries. You can see them listed on the screen. What that data told us is globally about 25% of incidents go underreported and about 31% in Australia. So Australia is about 6% above the global benchmark. Now, what that practically looks like is 50% of people experience an incident, 30% fail to report at least one, and 6.3 is the average number of incidents not reported. So if you were to look at an organisation of 3,000 people, you're looking at about 450 incidents that are potentially going underreported. So that's a fairly meaty piece of data that we're not actually necessarily getting access to. So so pretty significant amount of data. So over the course of a year, you can see a huge amount of impact of underreporting. Now, there are a number of reasons why underreporting occurs, but I'm keen to hear from the listeners on the call. What do you think are the primary reasons that underreporting might be happening within your organisation? Underappreciation, so a perceived lack of follow through by management, or it doesn't really matter if I report it, nothing gets done anyway kind of mindset. Fear or lack of trust, so if I report this, there's going to be a bit of shoot the messenger that happens. Maybe it's C, it's a difficult process, hard to do. Or D, you've got another thought. And if you do have another thought, and I can see some people do, chuck it in the chat. We've got a couple of people come through. So Amanda has said, assuming someone else has reported it. Yep, absolutely. Seems like too small or trivial or part of the job. Absolutely. And that often falls in the underappreciation, Cassandra, in that, I just fixed it myself and it wasn't a big deal. Assuming someone else reported, that's a good pickup, Amanda. I think that can easily happen in many instances. Great, so we might close that out now. Thanks, Cassie. So the split looks like 36% underappreciation, 11% fear, 43% difficult process. So that's a really interesting result, Alex. Surprising to you?
Oh, look, it's clearly reflective of the underreporting themes and drivers that you were talking to before. But yeah, absolutely pretty common themes there. I like the one that was in the other, actually, in terms of I assume someone else has reported it, which to your point, often adds to the confusion, if you like, around reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does the actual data from that sample set tell us? And look, it's not too far removed from some of the information that's come through, a slight difference. So the information that we were able to gather, the data we were able to gather, is that about 38% of incidents that went underreported were due to the underappreciation piece. So this is, I took care of myself, I didn't really see the point, or more than that, even if I did report it, nothing was going to get done about it anyway. All those sorts of clumped in together. So about 38% were driven by that. Very different to actually the results on the call. About 37% said that fear was one of the primary issues. So putting stuff into the reporting system can be like putting your head in the noose. So this is that shoot the messenger mindset that comes through. So in this space, it can be there can be significant social ramifications attached to reporting. Now, those social ramifications, interestingly, weren't just leader to employee, but they could often be peer on peer. And this was often linked, Alex, to a comment that you made earlier about unforeseen consequences of certain metrics. So, if we're providing bonuses or incentives based on lag indicators such as lost time injury frequencies and things like that, that can amplify this fear concept as an example. And driver number 3 is process. So again, very different to some people on the call, but in this particular bit of information or that we were able to gather, what we found was that it was perceived as being difficult to, about 25% of people said that the barrier was the difficulty in actually entering the information into the reporting system itself. So Alex, that's a very quick Reader's Digest version of the data. Now, Cassie is going to provide some information the chat, I believe, Cassie, a link to an ebook which provides a whole lot more information about underreporting. And in fact, if you want to dive into this topic further, there's a whole webinar previously recorded on this if you wanted to jump onto the Centre's website and dig into that. But to get on with today's webinar,
I've put the link in the chat for everyone now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Cassie. So Alex, we've gone and we've covered off a fair bit of information about underreporting, and it is a significant challenge / opportunity for a number of organisations. What are the implications for serious injury and fatality prevention of underreporting?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, Ant. Look, I think I guess the purpose of reporting is really to maximise learning, and so hence the drivers that you talked about. If we can address those things, if we can maximise, remove the fear around reporting, create better processes, provide feedback loops to people around, when they do report, so they understand the value and appreciate that level of reporting. It all enables us to learn more effectively. And so the actual data itself is actually important. And what some of that data, and I'll talk to that a bit more in a bit more detail, is that some of that data actually helps us to focus on weak signals and focus on potential. And so there is a lot of value in the lag data that comes through, and I'll talk to that. But it's, I guess, the underlying premise is that focusing on the underreporting issues does drive more insightful and our ability to kind of get more learning and maximize learning out of that data itself. And maybe I'll paint the picture a bit further in the subsequent slides. Ant?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So yeah, I think this is a good slide to sort of unpack that a little bit further.
Yeah, so I guess the context, and maybe this is revisiting some old theories. This is the old Heinrich triangle, and the Heinrich triangle was really well intended and well suited at the time. More contemporary science has obviously shed light in terms of how to look at this model in a more contemporary manner, if you like. But to give you a bit of context, the model itself is really trying to convey a causal relationship that lower order injuries has a direct and impactful relationship with high severity injuries. So for example, for every one severe or major injury, there are 30 or so minor injuries and a corresponding 300 accidents with no injuries. And so what that model in the old days was trying to really suggest is that there was a relationship, a direct relationship between addressing common incidents, and in doing so, you have a corresponding impact on those high severity kind of outcomes. And so effectively what it's driven is this, it's almost a zero harm approach, in that if you take care of everything, you will actually have a proportionate and equivalent impact on reducing high severity injuries. Contemporary thinking has challenged that model, and there is very much a case for the precursors and conditions within organizations specific to a narrow band of those hazards and emisses and minor injuries that can actually shed light on the high severity, high potential outcomes. And so really what we need to do is have a more discriminated view between those injuries that have a SIF potential, a serious injury fatality potential, versus those that don't. And what contemporary science is suggesting is that the things that we do for the lower order injuries, if you like, are very different to the impacts and consequences around the higher order, if you like. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think it's probably particularly in Centre's language dippy or a particular area of focus for a number of boards that we're talking to at the moment, given some of the changes in legislation and et cetera. They want to know that those big things are being managed and managed effectively. But we are seeing that challenge and transition for organisations, aren't we, where there's that kind of near obsession with those lost time injury frequency rates, and shifting the dial into thinking about not only the actual outcome of an incident, but the potential consequence of the incident, which is what you're talking about here, is becoming more and more of the sort of necessary focus.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, I think the metrics themselves are really valuable in that it gives us gives us light, sheds light on what's happened in terms of the low order kind of injuries. It's the greater value comes from discriminating between the data sets. And maybe just to expand on that, on that next slide, and if you would.
Yep.
It'd be good to kind of, play this out with an example. So, in the board conversations we're having in recent weeks, and this was actually quite a revealing insight to some board members. And so the example I'd provide you with is this example of an employee that fractures his or her foot. And you can see that in this scenario, we've got the outcome is the employee fractures their foot. In scenario A, they climb out of a truck cab, they miss the bottom step, they slip 30 centimeters to the ground, the foot rolls off a rock, and they fracture their foot. Scenario B, the scenario and context is very different. The end outcome is exactly the same. The employees fractured their foot when backed over by a forklift truck. The forklift operator backed up without looking, and the backup alarm wasn't functioning. So clearly the incident that should take our interest is the one that was the one where there was more potential for more serious injury or fatality potential, if you like. And what the implication of this nuanced view is that for leaders, having the ability to discriminate their data to distinguish between high potential events versus those that have no more potential than indeed to have a fractured foot is actually a really important distinction. And it's one that drives more effective classification, better governance, calibration, and more proportionate levels of resource, time, and effort around the investigations themselves. So you talked about, I think, the ICAM process or the process being convoluted or whatever it might be. I do feel those processes do add a lot of value in a very, very particular area where you can maximize learning. In some scenarios, the outcome is, the employee fractures their foot. Probably the key thing is that I should call out that we do need to care for all people, and minimizing harm to everyone is really, really important. Create an environment that's safe and that people feel, that they can talk about things in a very open and transparent way. But I think the contemporary science is suggesting that the things that we need to do for the low severity events is actually different to the high severity potential events. Does that make sense?
It does, and making the discerning difference about the potential and the actual outcomes is so important as part of that conversation. Just to build on that, Alex, I'm curious to hear from the group. So if you reflect on your own organizations, think about this idea of actual outcomes of incidents versus the potential attached to an incident that occurs, just like the example Alex shared. How much of a Guernsey is that conversation getting? That's probably one leading reflection question, but do you think that a number of potentially high potential incidents are going under the radar? So if you were to think about the quality of conversations you're having about the potential of incidents that occur, how deep you're diving into them, how far you're sort of projecting out the consequence. I'm curious to hear from the group, what's the percentage that you think may be getting missed in terms of that deeper dive analysis? So yeah, none? Do you reckon you've got it completely under control? 10 to 25, 25 to 45, or 45 plus? Just while that's getting covered, Alex, Lee's made a comment in the question section that basically said that word of mouth can have a pretty significant impact on the culture of the organization. And if there's a focus on naming and shaming of individuals, and that can basically build nearly an aura around reporting or incidents, which can sort of carry on long after the incident has occurred. Is that reflective of your experience?
Look, I've certainly been to sites where that's certainly been prevalent. I think ultimately the way leaders inquire about, respond, and provide resources to create that learning kind of environment is really, really key. So I think it's very, very much a leader-led culture in that sense, because of course all you need is it's the response to something going wrong that's actually really, really key, right? So clearly in that context that you described, there's been examples of where something does go wrong or there's an unintended event in our outcome. It's our response that really drives the culture that emanates, right?
Oh, it is, and I still remember early on in my career going to a particular site where a couple of employees had been removed from site due to breaching what was then at that time termed the golden rule, which is sort of the earlier iteration of these critical risks. And yeah, that had occurred about 4 or 5 years earlier, but the way that story had been told and passed on, it was like it had only happened yesterday. And to support Lee's comment, the fear and mistrust that had fostered without the environment, the us and them culture was huge. So I think the intent in which we're sort of exploring incidents and seeking to understand about what's happened matters so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a very strong hangover from the past of, you know, cardinal rules, golden rules, life-saving rules. You know, rules in itself is a bit of a parental frame, and so it starts to advocate for a different kind of response, right, in the organisation. So that's certainly shifting and changing as we've been talking to various clients.
Yep. So if we go back to the data we collected, looks like it was on zero, you're right, Ramesh, but it snuck up. So 13% say none are going unseen. Then we've got 66% of people think that it's about 10 to 25% are potentially slipping through without the required analysis. 6% in the 25 to 45 and 16% in the 45 plus. So again, a pretty big spread, but it looks like the majority of people reckon 10 to 25% is about where it's at for them in their organization. Alex, it'd be great to sort of see some benchmarking data around this. So what have you found in some of the analysis work that you've done?
Yeah, so it's interesting to see those perceptions coming through. It's often what we don't know, right? So, you know, we'd like to, and it also depends on the maturity of the organization as well. We do find some organizations have very, very good reporting requirements and a very nuanced appreciation of how to discriminate between potential versus actual. But what we're finding in some extensive data that we've done, and if you can activate the animation on that screen, we've done a lot of studies in the space, and so on average, and obviously there's been other studies that have been done globally as well. Alarmingly, what we found is that you know, there's up to 45% of those SIF potential. So I'm talking about the serious injury fatality potential kind of events going under the radar of corporate incident classification systems. And so what this means is that leaders, directors, officers are relying on data that is not necessarily that reliable. And they're not able to kind of, you know, inquire about or provide leadership in the space or even act or respond appropriately given the risk profile of the organization, because of course things are actually slipping under the radar. And so on the flip side of this is that there's 29% of incidents that actually attract unnecessary effort. You know, so I think one of the reporting or the process related driver underreporting is that we are actually trying to investigate everything. So we're spreading ourselves too thin. We've got limited resources in the organization to start with. And so, you know, how do we get the best outcomes and learning out of the events that can actually provide us with the most insight? And so we do need to, and I guess again, we do need to ensure that we do care for people and create an environment in which people are safe from all outcomes. But I think it's now a real case of having a different view on SIF versus non-SIF to try and address those kind of circumstances. But to give you an example, Ant, on the misclassification piece, I've got a couple of case studies here which might be useful to just share with those on the call. So the data here is from a very large set of incident data that came from a couple of organizations. And so here what we're finding is that, and these are very mature organizations, I should say, so organizations that are in the high risk sector, in both power gen and mining were the two organizations. And what we found was that their corporate classification system, for whatever reason, wasn't able to pick up this nuanced view on very specific potential incident scenarios. And so we've seen the classification, and as you can see on the screen with the reds are where there was actually within the minor risk categories, within the negligible risk categories, there are actually some SIF potential events. And so again, back to the underreporting issue is that we need good quality reporting. We need reliable data we need to actually classify it correctly to start with to maximize our learning and provide those limited resources to do the deeper investigations and learning teams and etc. So it's another good example of in terms of how the cascading effect and impact in terms of learning. And
So Alex, why, like, so you go back to that earlier stat of 45% of serious incidents flying under the radar and 29% attracting unnecessary effort. A little bit terrifying, I think, if you're leading that organization or on the board of that organization. Why is it that that miscategorization and that, I guess, misdirected effort, for lack of a better term, is happening? What are some of the common drivers that you're seeing?
Oh, it's a good question, and that's a complex one to unpack as well. Look, I think it's a socio-technical kind of context, and so on one hand, some of the drivers of that would be there tends to be a lot of metrics around reporting and classification, and I'll say KPIs rather than metrics. So metrics are really important. Setting targets on those metrics as a KPI starts to drive different behavioural and outcomes, and so I've worked within high-risk contexts, and the response to something going unplanned tends to be absolutely care for the individual, but then the follow-up conversation is, well, how are we going to classify this? And so there's some drivers and some cultural issues and leadership issues there that drive the misclassification. I think it's also around the knowledge to be able to discriminate things in a unbiased manner. There are too many kind of biases that kind of get involved with classification, and so having clear systems, the knowledge space to be able to differentiate, but also the cognitive bias that comes with classification when you're inside the business also tends to interfere with this, right? So, but there's probably a lot more to unpack with another webinar on that one in itself, Ant.
Yeah, look, and I've got a lot of empathy, I think, for organisations as they're sort of looking at making sense of this safety data because of the reporting requirements. And again, if you're responsible for this data, or a leader within the organisation, what you're potentially reporting here, if this is the primary focus, is, not great news, depending on the way that you've categorised it. Well, that's how it can be viewed anyway, by different elements of the organisation. So again, that intent, that mindset around learning and trying to get better becomes so important if we're going to foster effective analysis of this data, which comes to, I guess, this concept of culture and serious injury and fatality prevention. So culture does and will have an impact on not only the volume of data that is collected within organizations, the quality of data that is reported, but also what's done with that data. And we see this play out time and time and time again. Now, again, to share a little bit of our own research, again, for those of you, some of you may be familiar with this. If you're not, this is data pulled from our Driving a Positive Safety Culture resource, where we analysed, I think it was about 26,000 people across 86 odd organisations to look at, well, what's the difference between high-performing safety cultures and what are the key drivers of high-performing versus not so high-performing safety cultures. So you can see here, organisations that sit in the counterproductive to public compliance. So this is at lower end of the maturity scale. This tends to be a culture that's typified by blame and avoidance, lack of accountability and responsibility, safety, something that's done to me as opposed to something that I take proactive ownership of, tend to be categorized by these key areas. So there's a perception in these organizations that safety procedures aren't very useful or practical for the end user, so that the quality of them is perceived to be poor. And generally, if you dig in the surface and you're in the focus groups, you hear language like, really, policies and procedures are just a backside covering exercise by management. They don't actually care, except to make sure that they've covered their own liabilities. That then cascades down into a perception of management safety commitment, in that there's a perception that leaders only care about safety when something goes wrong. They're not really committed to safety. Their words don't match their actions. Internal context is also influenced by this. So internal context relates to how do we respond to maybe something that goes wrong. Do we make knee-jerk reactions? Do we, is change management managed poorly? is a chopping and changing of directions and not clear objectives given. So there tends to be a sense in these organisations that there's a reactive safety culture at play. In these cultures, again, amplified willingness to report incidents and errors, a real issue for some of the reasons that we spoke about earlier. And employee safety performance reflects employees basically feeling like they only hear about safety when something goes wobbly. So yeah, it's that old headspace where it's, I work safely 99.99% of the time. I make safe choices. I can even do things proactively to help other people stay safe. But if something goes wrong, look out. I'm going to be hauled in front of management and asked a bunch of really hard and tricky questions. Now, you can see how a culture like that, cascading from the board down, will have an impact not only on the volume of data you get, the quality of data you get, but also the willingness to really dig into that data and understand it and interrogate it. Alex, on the flip side, organizations who do this really well, clear safety mission and vision, generally focusing on a presence of safety versus an absence of safety. There's a perception that safety leaders, that managers walk the talk. There's a high focus on within team communication to solve problems and look out for one another. We see a stronger sense of safety responsibility from everyone within the workforce, and team support for safety tends to be higher. So in these organizations, we tend to see you tend to see less resistance to safety initiatives and projects that are rolled out. And more than that, we tend to see safety initiatives start to bubble up from the workforce, where people are taking proactive or are making suggestions about what can be done better. Now, there's two elements to that. One, those suggestions need to be made in the first place, but two, leaders need to be willing to hear those suggestions and enable them to happen. So when we see that start to happen, we can start to see some really big shifts in the way that data is used. And I think we've got a case study about where we've seen some good cultural impacts on safety performance next, don't we, Alex?
Yeah, we do. And so, and in fact, I think from a cultural perspective, the more mature cultures and have really positive attributes in terms of leadership, culture, and critical risk management. And we see leaders, actively inquiring about leading indicators. They respond to weak signals, and that really kind of canvasses and amplifies the culture of learning, right? So I think, and in the field, this plays out slightly differently. We've got leaders of work groups that respond positively to better understanding how workarounds are undertaken, and then we also find that there is a more proactive approach in terms of identifying presence of controls, right? So I think this case study will be really useful, and I think we've had a listener asking for a case study as well, and so hence we introduced this data. So I'll walk through this fairly carefully. It is a busy slide. So this is a very large utilities organization, and we did some deep dive in analytics on their incidents, their near misses, and in fact some hazards as well. In fact, a lot of hazards. And really looking at, so if you recall that model that I showed you before around the pyramid, and so effectively what we're trying to do is identify within that pyramid of data, what is the data that can actually give us more learning from a serious injury fatality perspective. And so really what we did was we narrowed down to that triangle within the triangle to identify, well, where are the weak signals in the hazard data? Where are the potential incidents from a serious injury fatality potential perspective? And so what we found was actually quite interesting in that, and if you look at the pie charts down the bottom to start with, we found that 87% of those incidents were actually classified, and these were SIF incidents were classified as being internally as a low level or a moderate level. And so what that means is straight away we've got things going under the radar, not necessarily harnessing the attention of investigations or even leaders really trying to inquire about those risk contexts, if you like. And on the flip side, we've also got that on the other pie chart, 47% of those incidents were actually non-SIF, but they had they actually had a disproportionate level of investigation on incidents in the risk context that actually probably doesn't lend itself to more than that fractured ankle kind of scenario. Not that we don't care about that individual, right? So I need to don't want to overlay with that point. But I think what we're saying is that, can we maximize learning if we can find that more nuanced approach around SIF potential? What was interesting about this organisation was that over that 2-year period, there were a number of interventions that were run. So leadership interventions, critical control, amplification of critical controls, workforce engagement in those critical controls, and really trying to also address the underreporting issues that were more prevalent historically. And what we found here was that, and there were a number of initiatives across the organisation, we found that there was actually a very large material reduction in recordable incidents, and also quite a amplification of near misreporting. So near misreporting went through the roof, which is fantastic, which means that they're classified, and we can maximize learning around those incidents as well. And so there was a number of initiatives that we kind of went to play, and I'll talk you through in the subsequent slide. But effectively what happened was the exposure to SIF potential went down year on year. Quite a dramatic shift. And that was really around leaders at an executive level, but also cascading right down into the field. We're actually proactively focused on the presence of controls is really the key to this. To give you some examples of the interventions on the next slide, and so what you can see here, if you can see the slide here, on the left-hand side, what we found was of those SIF incidents, we identified the risk categories in which there was a high degree of prevalence of a SIF potential occurring. So we've analysed the data, we've classified it effectively, and we've had a look at the risk categories in which these SIF potential incidents are occurring. And what that gives the organisation is a lens as to, well, where do I prioritise my limited resource, time, and efforts to minimise exposure to the people on the ground. And so again, with the preceding data, the year-on-year data, there was a whole bunch of initiatives in these particular areas to reduce exposure to people in the workforce. The middle column of data is really around classification integrity. That's the originating data. So there was a lot of that data that I mentioned before where it was actually misclassified, hence not getting the deserved attention of leaders and the organisation to investigate, intervene, maximise learning outcomes.
Thanks, Alex. And I think the really useful part of this information when we unpacked it was not only did it help the organisation get a clear focus on where the big risks and hazards are sitting, and gave them an opportunity to look at their controls, but it also gave us the opportunity to look at what were the weak signals preceding some of these things taking place. And there's some really interesting overlap. This organisation also did a safety climate survey as well, and there was some really nice alignment and clarity there. Now, the benefit of that from an organisational perspective is, because you've only got so many resources available, because you've only got so much bandwidth, you're really able to zero in on the initiatives or the issues and initiatives that are ultimately going to give the best return on investment and reduce that risk profile the most significantly. So a lot of this is about getting data that you're already collecting and actually making it work for you, putting it into a format, putting it into a process which gives you a new lens on the world, creates epiphanies or insights that enables you to drive really proactive and useful interventions. And I guess that probably leads to the next slide, Alex. When you get this data, when you make good sense of it in the way that this organisation has, what does it look like to make good use of your safety data?
Yeah, so look, I think there's probably 4 or 5 key areas that you can benefit from, right? So clearly, actually preceding all of that, underreporting and creating a culture of reporting is really, really key, because you can then extract greater value out of the data. So in the first instance, it's really around being able to discriminate between high severity, high consequence from low severity, low consequence, and knowing what things and levers we need to do to address those two contexts, if you like, because they are different. They've got a relationship, but they are different. I think number 2 is really around the clarity of the risk profile of those risk activities that had the high SIF exposure. So the example that we shared before, motor vehicle was actually the most a prevalent risk context that was creating an exposure to people in the workforce. And then it was, working at heights, falling objects, and animal attack. It actually went right under the radar, yet that was actually the most prevalent exposure within that organisation. So it really gives you clarity around where to prioritise my limited resources. Probably the key thing that the utilities client did was that they very quickly and proactively started to strengthen the controls that were ineffective in the field as determined by the data. And there's a whole bunch more data, maybe that's, again, another webinar, that help them understand, well, if these are the risk categories that are most prevalent for us, well, what do we do specifically in those risk categories to make those controls more effective? As an example, improvement of risk assessments was one of those areas for them. So plant and equipment design, redesign, and better engagement of the workforce during pre-starts was a key one, which I think it's there's a very strong school of thought around engagement during shift handovers and pre-starts, but this was an area that was very clear as an opportunity for them to amplify engagement and manage critical risk activities. The other piece was they selected some very specific work that had to be redesigned because it was actually succumbed to some of the human factors that we identified through the analysis, in that there was autopilot and stress and urgency and and some of these kind of brain limiting kind of factors, if you like, that we're all succumbed to. And it actually gave the organizational lens to actually redesign some very specific work to reduce that exposure.
Yeah, so that's great, Alex. So some really clear focus areas to support that organisation in working through, I guess, effective management of some of those critical risks. So we are going to roll through to some questions in just a moment, but to paraphrase out the opportunities to consider for your organisation, what we'd be asking to consider is, have you set up conditions that support reporting? And have you actually, I guess, put the data together in a way that it supports and enables insightful analysis and data gathering? So it's one thing to collect data, but it's another thing to get the data to tell a meaningful story that enables proactive change. And there's a really nice opportunity here is if you can make good use of the safety data like this organisation has, it actually gives you an opportunity to go back to the workforce and show them what gets done with that data and talk to them about the learnings that can be applied and the organisational improvement that can be applied through the efforts that they've made in putting that data into the system. So there's a really nice feedback loop that can be created if that data is used effectively. Number two, leaders should seek to understand how and why underreporting is occurring within the organisation and respond positively reports of safety incidents and near misses. So we covered that in a little bit of detail, but if you suspect you're not getting all the data that you should be getting, then I think digging into that and understanding the drivers of that are really important, and you can make significant positive impacts quickly by doing that. You want to ensure that there's effective governance and reliable data metrics for SIF exposure. And what we'd be challenging you to think about and differentiate is the difference between SIF and non-SIF. Now, what we're starting to see organisations report through to boards, even if it's not to the exclusion of your lost time injury frequency rates, because that can be a hard metric to let go of. But looking at, okay, yes, well, that's our lost time injury frequency rate. Let's also talk about our SIF exposure and how effectively our controls are doing. And then, what that also feeds into is a really nice way of, as you can see in the next slide, I guess reporting on the critical controls that have been put into place for high risk activities. So if you can get really clear on that SIF exposure, measure that, then it actually sets a really nice platform to start to look at how you can measure the presence of safety through those critical control interventions that have been put into place. And then number 5, adopt advanced analytic analysis to incorporate corporate learning. So again, this is speaking to actually use that data in a useful manner. Get it in and pull it apart, look at those weak signals, and take some deliberate time. I don't think this is a monthly thing, is it, Alex? Like what, a quarterly basis? Get into your data, do a deep dive, and see what it's telling us. What's your recommendation?
I think given there's a lack of well, there's a potential lack of understanding what the history looks like. I think having a snapshot in time in terms of what is our current risk profile, what's our classification integrity look like, how effective is our governance around high risk activities. I think there's obviously a body of work to be done to assess that to start with, but then I then think that you can then dovetail back to, well, how do you make that a dynamic approach in terms of how we do business moving forward, rather than relying on very large assessments. You can actually integrate this into the way you actually do things in the business. And so we're actually seeing clients doing initial assessments and then that informing how they acquire the data, what interventions they put in place, and how they continuously monitor that, rather than it being a point in time.
Yep, great. Which gives possibly a more valuable metric to the business to consider when it comes to safety. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I like about what you said before around you know, not necessarily being one or the other. I think it is both. So, you know, boards do are kind of hooked on the TRIFR indicators for all sorts of different reasons. I think it's the so what question that we ask ourselves. You know, so what do we do with that data? How do we maximize learning out of the data? And what's the story going to tell us to reduce exposure to the field? And that's actually where the data is most valuable. It's, well, how do we actually change the way the risk context works for the people on the ground? And so I think taking this nuanced approach will actually drive a different conversation at the board end. And I think that's for us as safety professionals to kind of drive that conversation, change the conversation, so that we're actually educating and creating awareness and upward communication as a driver to, you know, to provide a different conversation.
Yeah, I like that. So what? So what does this data tell us, and what do we do differently? That's a good thought. Okay, so I'm going to open up the questions section now for anyone who has any specific questions that they want to shoot through to us. And I can see there's a couple of comments that have gone in that I'm going to have to catch up on in just a moment. We've also had a number of questions come through prior to the session, so we've got about 8 minutes left. So we will prioritize the live questions that come through. So if you want to put those in to the chat now, feel free to do so whilst we cover off on a couple of call to actions. If you want to know more about how to make sense of your incident data and get some of the insights like the ones that we've shared today, feel free to click yes on the poll, and one of the team will get in touch with you to walk you through the process for getting to understand your incident data. So again, no obligations, anything like that. It's just an opportunity to catch up with one of the teams, such as Alex, and talk through your data situation and your objectives, and how this process can potentially support you in garnering some more insights. So I'll give another.
Yeah, what might be helpful, Ant, in those conversations is to actually show folk how the data analytics works, because there might be some little inspirations that people have as a walkaway. And there's a lot more data that underpins those 2 slides that I shared with you before for the purpose of the webinar, Ant. But there's a lot more data that can kind of unfold out of that.
Yeah, so if you're interested in that, I can see a few people are, which is great. Just click yes, and if not, that's cool as well. So we're just wait until the thing stops moving. While that's going through, I think we're just about done there. Cassie will close that one out. We have also designed, to support this conversation, a climate survey module that specifically focuses on the cultural elements that help or hinder a culture of critical control management, or talk to individuals and organizations' ability to manage critical risk. So again, if you're interested in understanding more about that module and how that process works from a cultural perspective, so are you setting up the cultural conditions that support this focus on critical risk, there's an opportunity to express your interest here as well. And again, one of our team will get in touch with you and just talk you through a little bit more about what we're looking to understand and measure when it comes to looking at a culture that effectively manages serious injury and fatality prevention, or critical risk, as it's sometimes termed. So we've just got that going through. So we've had a quick question come through live here, Alex, from Tony. And Tony has asked, do you have industry benchmark data we can reference for such a?
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's a really good question. There are absolutely some very large scale global studies that have been done in SIF exposure. It's in fact on one of the slides that I was referring to earlier. It was noted on the bottom right hand corner. So there are some studies that have been done quite some time ago across a lot of different industries, and there's some papers that I'm happy to share with you, Tony, on that. What we tend to find through the work we've been doing is that there's somewhere between 20 to 45% of incidents that are actually misclassified. So your SIF exposure is somewhere in that range. That obviously depends on maturity, systems, industry sector. So what we find, as you probably anticipate, the more high reliability organizations, as they call them, they do have far more maturity in this space, as does power gen. You'd expect that would have a lower kind of SIF exposure, and then mining, transport, utilities, etc. So it depends on the risk context, depends on the industry, but yeah, there's certainly some studies that lend itself to benchmarking, if you like.
Yeah, great, thanks. So we'll get back in touch with you, Tony, to provide some of that information. Lee has made a number of interesting comments on here, but just one that I'll call out. Depending on the severity, incidents should determine how often data is analysed. So if people don't see immediate change in the scenario, the safety culture will suffer. If people are under the impression that the business is not putting safety first. So I think what Lee's saying is that depending on the number of incidents that you're having and the amount of data you're collecting, maybe that should determine the frequency in which you're diving into some of this and looking at closing the loop.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we tend to start our analytics with longitudinal analysis. So effectively, we'll look at the last year or two's worth of incidents, and that gives you immediately a lot of richness in the data. But I do think that from a critical risk perspective, as we are analysing the data, regardless of volume, if we've got an exposure in the way we manage critical controls, that is deserving of attention. Because we know that those high-risk activity contexts have critical controls that, through history and time, tells us are the last lines of defence, if you like, to mitigate something, if not for luck, going pear-shaped. So I would be advocating for responding to that data dynamically, as distinct from doing it in deep dive analysis from period to period. But I think, to your point, you need to start somewhere, and if you're not doing that already, I think having a nuanced approach for that data analytics, analysing the data, looking at your last year or two's worth of data, and seeing where your starting gate is. Because quite often what we find in the risk register, in the critical risk framework, or the cardinal rules, or whatever it might be, is a risk profile that doesn't necessarily match the risk profile of the work you do today. And risk context change, right? So
that's great. Alex, thank you for that bit of a summary. Thank you, everyone, for jumping on board and participating so much in the chat. Look, there's a bunch of questions we haven't been able to get to, so we'll strive to respond to those later on. But again, thank you for dialing in on what's been a very important topic. And Alex, thank you for some really insightful thoughts around this really important topic of serious injury and fatality prevention.
Oh,
and not
really
too bad
that I could participate.
And not too bad for your maiden webinar, mate. Well done. So again, thank you, everyone. Alex, hopefully see you again soon, and take care. The recording will be going out, as will slide notes and all the rest of it. So keep an eye out for that. Again, thank you, and be in touch soon.